Psalm 11:3. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this group of people, and I thank you that we're able to come and share and hear your word today. Give me the words to speak and bless the ears as they listen. Amen.
Amen.
On top of this verse, it would be impossible to read all the history of the kings of Israel. And the history of the kings of Israel, if you study them, it's a long progressions from good to wicked. And so if you watch in there multiple times, one king will be a little bit worse than the last one, and then a little bit worse than the last one, and pretty soon they're full on worshiping idols and sacrificing babies. Sounds familiar? So keep that all in mind as we talk through this today. So before I get on to today's topic, I want to review a little bit of what we've talked about before. It's one of the blessings and curses of doing a multiple part series is I got to take 5 or 10 minutes to get all the information back out into your brain so you remember where we came from. But we got to do it. And we have a lot to cover today, so put your seatbelts on. So remember in week 1, we were talking about just the overall idea of home. And home, about how home is more than just a structure. It's more than just a place where you hang your hat and eat your dinner at night. It's God's order. It's the place and the people that you feel at home with. And so I want to remind you of the definition that we're using as we go through this series. From Dr. Stephen Wolfe. Home is a place of complacent delight, generated by the activity of loved ones, which adorns space with intimate familiarity across generations in order to perfect the union of a particular people and to foreshadow the union of a people to come. So that's the idea that what home is supposed to be a reflection of what heaven is. And if your home doesn't feel like that, then maybe there's some work to do. And so I was proposing the idea that as a country, our country doesn't feel like home anymore. At least not to me. And I've only been alive for, it'll be 49 years next month. And so I haven't seen it fall as far as some people have, and I've seen it fall further than other people have. And I can't imagine what the difference the founding fathers would see between what they saw and what they founded and what the world is today. Then last week we talked about the idea of Balaam's curse and the slow, gradual degradation of where we were to where we are now. Well, actually we covered about the first maybe 75 years. We started with the Second Great Awakening, and we talked about the formation of some of those early and major Christian-adjacent movements such as Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventism, and Mormonism. We also discussed the thinkers of the day like Karl Marx and Charles Darwin and how their thinking has influenced the way we think now. We also talked about one of my favorite characters in history, one of my favorite villains, and that is John Harvey Kellogg, and how his ideas on nutrition have more than shaped a lot of who we are today. His ideas on nutrition as well as purity and sexuality. So today, we're going to pick up where we left off from there. So one of the main differences between what I talked about last week and what I want to talk to you about this week is that last week was likely a bunch of information that you maybe didn't know already, or you hadn't put the pieces together like that. You've probably heard of Marx and Darwin and Jehovah's Witnesses, but you probably hadn't really put the pieces together of how we got from where we were a purely Puritan Protestant country that thought about the sovereignty of God and had a good understanding of who he was, to these false religions and false ideas, and how that affected actually the whole world on a global stage. And hopefully I was able to paint a pretty reasonable picture of that slow decline of what America once was and what it is now. The more I've looked at it over the course of the last week, the more appropriate I see that analogy of Balaam's curse and the story of the camel getting its nose under the tent are to the story. But today we step into the part where all those small and large compromises really start to become systems of belief that have affected us as a people and as a world, where the enemy stopped whispering in the dark and began to publish his plans in textbooks, policies, and pulpits. So my burden today is I'm going to start talking about the 19th century, which is a very familiar topic to most people. Yeah, but we're going to re-examine it. We're going to be looking at it from this greater big picture, and hopefully I'm able to put it in a light that makes sense with the puzzle that we're talking about. All that stuff that we all learned about in high school, World War I, World War II, the 50s, the 60s, all the stuff that the TV shows and the movies that we all grew up watching is made about. But these are also events that our parents and our grandparents actually lived through, and if you were lucky enough to have conversations with them, you probably heard them talk about what the world was like during and after those events. I still remember the one time, my grandfather served in World War II. He was a radio operator in Europe and the Pacific. And he didn't talk, just like most people of that age and that generation, he didn't talk about it a whole lot. Not because he didn't want to, it was just something that was part of his life. And so he didn't ever really talk to us about it. Until one summer, he was up visiting my family. They were visiting my family for the summer, which is what they usually did. And this was after they had gone back. He and my grandma had flown over to France, and they were part of, I think it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And when my grandparents came back, I think I saw my grandfather cry maybe twice in my life. And when he sat there that day, and they pulled us up to the trailer where they were sitting, and we all set up chairs around the outside, and they played videos of Normandy Beach and all those things, and the festivities that they had seen while they were there. My grandfather started to cry, and he started to tell us about the experiences that he had storming the beach. He didn't storm the beaches, he came later, but he was there in Europe during those days. And his story is that he and my grandma was like 19 when they got married, and she got pregnant. My grandfather went off to war. My uncle was born while he was serving in Europe. He got back. He was home for about 2 weeks, I think he was home for 2 months. She got pregnant again, and my grandpa shipped off to the Pacific. So both my dad and my uncle were born while my grandfather was serving overseas for the Allies as a radio operator. My goal today is not making you 19th century scholars, because there are literally scores of books and podcasts and movies made about each one of these topics. So it would really be impossible to try to help to get you to understand things on that level. I personally read probably a dozen books over the course of the last couple of years on this topic, and listened to probably 100 hours worth of podcasts. So there's no way I'm able to condense that amount of information down into 45 minutes. But what I hope to do today is give you, like I said, a broad overview, is to connect a few dots that you may not have seen before, and put those dots in the greater arc of our discussion about home. I also want to maybe remove some of the sacred cow veneers that are placed on many of these events and characters. There is a common saying in the world that the victors get to write the story. In very few places is that more true than the story of the 19th century. Certain people and events have been mythologized to the point that they are both not to be questioned at all, but they're actually even far from the truth. And there's multiple opinions about each one of them that, again, I won't get into all of the different ways that we could go about that. Overall, the big picture that I want to talk about is really the degradation of the family. For the first 100 years or so of this country, 150 years, family was the building block of what this country was built on. Strong Christian homes built on Christian values, with husbands and fathers leading the way. And that's very far from what we see in our world today. Husbands and fathers have been placed on at least a second, if not third tier compared to the rest of the world, the rest of the population. And the family has been wiped out. The idea of a strong family is almost non-existent these days. And that is very much closely aligned with communist ideology. They want to destroy absolutes. They want to put everybody on the same playing field. They want to rid the world of Christianity and strong families. Therefore, the state can become God. I want to share a little something with you here that I found the other day, and this is just reinforces what I'm talking about in regards to the family. This is a little clip that I found about the difference between the amount of money that young men made back in 1910 compared to what young men make nowadays. So this is a description of about a young man working on a young engineer working on the Panama Canal around 1910. So a junior civil engineer at that time with just 2 or 3 years of experience was paid $250 a month. That doesn't sound like a lot compared to today's money. About $3,000 a year. Working on the Panama Canal was hazardous, so the engineer earned $25 more a month than he could have earned if he had stayed in the United States as a form of hazard pay. He received 42 days of paid vacation, 30 sick days, and here's the big one, he didn't pay any income tax on it either, because the US didn't have income tax at the time. So in terms of hard money, what does that look like? $3,000. Back then, an ounce of gold was about $20. So that same $3,000 could buy 150 ounces of gold around 1910. At today's prices, that $3,000 buying 150 ounces of gold would equate to about $450,000 for a civil engineer with 3 years of experience. Nowadays, the average engineer with a similar experience level makes between $60,000 and $80,000 a year. It's no wonder women have to go to work. It's no wonder they're not there to raise their children in their home, because our economy has been degraded that far. So one thing I want you to keep in mind as we're going through this is a couple of scriptures about the importance of family. Deuteronomy 6:6-7 says, "And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up." Malachi 4:5-6 says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a curse." That's the power of family. That's how you're supposed to train your children. When we have a system that is designed to put our kids in public schools and be indoctrinated by the state, these principles cannot be applied. Before I jump into the next part, I want to present that perhaps a better name for World War I and World War II is really the Great Civil War of the West. These were literally families. In World War II, they were literally families that were fighting against each other. Tsar Nicholas of Russia, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and George V of England were literally first cousins, and they were fighting in a world war, more like a family feud. Yes, these were nations, but also a family feud. All of these countries, too, were historically Christian ones. Also, before I jump in, I want to give you a few sources so that you can fact check me and not call me crazy. First is 2 books by Pat Buchanan, Death of the West, and then Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, those both by Pat Buchanan. The Martyr Made podcast is a fantastic podcast. He digs into history, and he did a 32-hour podcast series on the Jonestown Massacre. He did a 25-hour series of podcasts on the early history of Zionism and the formation of Israel. And that was just from 1900 to 1948. 25 hours. What was the Jonestown Massacre? You ever heard the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid? So drink the Kool-Aid came from the Jonestown Massacre. Jim Jones was He was a socialist, but he was a pastor, but he used his pastor position to promote socialism and communism. And he convinced a bunch of people in the 60s and 70s. Like, he had a giant, huge church, and he fought for social causes. His history, like, if you listen to his history, he used the concepts from dedication and leadership to build and make a church, and then try to promote social issues. Anyway, he convinced over 900 of his followers to move to Guyana. And then he convinced them that the world was out to get them. And then he convinced them all at the same time then to drink cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. And over 900 people committed suicide, mass suicide at one time, including parents dosing their children with cyanide. So that's kind of one of the end results of, like, that's where communism and socialist ideas get you down the road. But that's a whole nother topic, as you can imagine. Before we jump into World War II, or World War I and World War II, we gotta set the stage a little bit. So, late 1800s, no income tax in the United States. Income tax was first implemented in the United States during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln in order to fuel the northern armies. After the Civil War ended, they got rid of income tax again, and the country was primarily financed by tariffs. It was one of the richest times in American history. They were literally looking for things to do with all the money that they made. Teddy Roosevelt then went along. So William McKinley was one of the guys that pioneered tariffs. When he was executed in 1904 or 5, Teddy Roosevelt became president. Teddy Roosevelt is one of my favorite all-time historical figures. Like, he literally had a wrestling mat in the basement of the White House and had wrestling matches with diplomats. He was a combination of Indiana Jones and George Washington. The guy literally charted an uncharted river down in the Amazon. He hunted grizzly bears. And like I said, he had wrestling matches in the White House. I would argue that he is perhaps the last great true America first president that we had in this country. And he was president from 1904 till 1908. In 1913, anyone know what happened in 1913? Foundation of the forming of the Federal Reserve and the implementation of income tax. I won't get into all the implications of what that means, but the Federal Reserve, those who founded the Federal Reserve, this is just an interesting aside. The site where they, Jekyll Island is where they wrote up all the documents and signed all the documents to form the Federal Reserve, which is not a government agency, by the way. It is a private agency founded and commissioned by the federal government, but it is completely a private organization. But the place where they founded it, Jekyll Island, is a site where they discovered the bones of giants, Nephilim. Again, there's a whole book about it that I won't get into. It's fascinating. Also, do you know the connection between the Federal Reserve and the sinking of the Titanic? The sinking of the Titanic, the ship that sank was not actually the Titanic. There was a ship that they had commissioned 3 ships at the same time. The Titanic set sail, was ready first. It went out. No, it was a different ship that went out. It was the Titanic and the Republic and one other one. And they sent one of them out, and it got into a catastrophic accident. But they limped it back to the dock. And they refitted it out as the Titanic. But it had already catastrophic damage to it. So they patched it up and they sent it out again. And there were a group of families that were trying to get the Federal Reserve started and going. And there were some of these are like the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers, some of the richest families in the world. And there were a big group of them that were supportive of it, and there were a few that were not supportive of it. And they were all set to go set sail and cross the Atlantic on the Titanic to have their meeting to set up the Federal Reserve. Well, at the last minute, several of them decided not to set sail on the Titanic and wait for another ship. The ones that were opposed to the Federal Reserve were on the Titanic. And we all know what happened to the Titanic. It sank. And I'm not going to tell you that it was a conspiracy. I'm also not going to tell you that it wasn't. That's just a little aside. You can do your own research on that. It's wild, I've done it, and I'm convinced. But I'm not going to make that claim because I'm supposed to be preaching the truth. So World War I started in 1914, but we got to go back again just a little bit to the 1871, which is the unification of Germany following the Franco-Prussian War. Before that, there was no country known as Germany. And very quickly, due to its size and the people and its culture, it became one of the most powerful industrial and military nations in Europe. But it was a peaceful country. Bismarck, who was the leader of Germany at the time, he said, keep France isolated, keep Britain friendly, and never fight against Russia. And he maintained that peace over the course of the next 20 years. In 1890, the Kaiser, the one that was the cousin of the Tsar of Russia and the King of England, got rid of Bismarck, and over time, things started to deteriorate in Europe. The treaty that they had with Russia expired. So then France signs a treaty with Russia. This is all playing into events. In 1904, Britain signed a treaty with France. So now you have Britain, France, and Russia all in alliance. And then you have, in 1907, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed a treaty. So now you have these two triple treaties that are balancing power in Europe. In 1913, wars between Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and the Ottoman Empire started to break out. And Serbia ended up becoming the strong and defiant one and ended up with Russian backing. And Austria-Hungary feels threatened by Serbia. And the Balkans become the powder keg of Europe. In 1914, then this is the hard part that they tell you. In 1914, Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria blamed Serbia and demanded justice and proof of its government's involvement. And Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia with 10 specific demands designed to investigate and punish the conspirators. The demands are harsh but not impossible. In the end, Serbia agreed to 9.5 out of 10. The only thing they didn't want to do was allow Austrian officials to conduct official investigations inside of Serbia. And this became the excuse for escalation, because Austria-Hungary rejected it, and in the end declared war on Serbia on July 28th of 1914. Then Russia, which is bound by its treaty, mobilizes to protect Serbia. Germany warns Russia to stand down, but it doesn't. So on August 1st, Germany declares war on Russia. And then they implement what's called the Schlieffen Plan, which was a plan that a German general had put into, German field marshal, they were called field marshals back then. He had developed this plan to, in case Germany ever went to war. And his plan, because he knew Russia would take a long time to mobilize, he was going to wipe out, he had to swing his army through Belgium and into France, because he had to take out France too, because France had declared war on them because they're in alliance with Russia and England. So to defeat France quickly and to be able to get back to Germany in order to protect itself from Russia. But they had to go through Belgium. And Belgium had a neutrality clause that if anyone violated it, it was bad news. And so by Germany traveling through Belgium to France, they violated Belgian neutrality, thus thrusting all of Europe into war. In the end, there was no real necessity for war. Austria almost got everything it asked for. Germany could have restrained its allies, and Britain could have remained neutral, because when Belgium was invaded, Britain felt obligated to jump into the fight. Again, this is a family feud, so each of these powers are acting out of pride, fear, and obligation to treaties, not actual principle. Had Britain remained neutral, the conflict might have been localized to a Balkan conflict. So that's a quick summary of World War II. Again, there's hours and hours and hours that you could talk about in relationship to World War I and all the things and all the power players and all the different effects that it had. So this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. This was the first time that you had that many countries at war with each other all at the same time. 10 million soldiers and civilians died. The monarchies in Germany, Austria, Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire were all destroyed. They implemented, I don't know if you ever heard of trench warfare. Trench warfare is where they literally dig trenches on both sides of the battlefield, and they would line them with soldiers, and they would just shoot at each other across these big open fields. And they couldn't leave, because if they tried to get up out of the trench, they would get shot. And so if someone got shot in the trench, they literally had to bury them in the bottom of the trench. So here these guys were walking across the dead bodies of their fallen comrades. And it was flooding. So these trenches, which were 6 feet deep, were sometimes halfway full of water because they didn't drain. The conditions were horrific. They talked about these trenches like meat grinders, the amount of death that would happen in these trenches. They would get sick, bacteria, disease, and then they started using gas attacks. This was the first time chemical warfare was used in the history of combat. And they would send these gas attacks, and they would open these gas canisters, and the wind would blow this gas across these big open fields, and from one trench into another, inflicting horrible symptoms: coughing, sneezing, difficulty breathing, vomiting. On all this, on top of the horrific conditions, starvation and dehydration that they were already experiencing. So in 1918, they finally ended the war. They signed a treaty. Germany surrendered. Again, 10 million people dead. In the wake of World War I and the fall of the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks took over under the leadership of Lenin, and the first communist state was formed. People didn't want this to ever happen again. And so the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations, was formed under Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States. So again, 1918, the armistice is signed on November 11th. The shooting stops, but the whole world was dying, slowly but surely. Christian monarchies were all but gone, and a secular, progressive new order was taking place, led by men who believed that they could rebuild civilization without Christianity, without a foundation on God. In 1919, they signed the Treaty of Versailles. It was supposed to be a peace conference led by Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau of France, and Lloyd George of Britain. It was a so-called peace treaty, but what actually it turned into was a way to inflict vengeance on the German people. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war. Again, the victors write the story, even though Germany was not the cause. Yes, they were part of it, but they were not ultimately the cause of World War I. They were required to pay reparations that were so massive that they crushed the German people for generations to come. They were supposed to pay back all the countries for all the losses that they had experienced during those 4 years of war. It was all placed on Germany. They were told to completely disarm and surrender their territory, especially those that were rich in coal, iron, and agriculture. They lost land that had been part of the German population for long periods, long time. They were made to be humiliated for their role in the war. As a result of this, Germany, the original government of Germany was disbanded, and it became the Weimar Republic, a fragile democracy born in defeat and shame. Very quickly, hyperinflation began to wipe out the middle class. Like their currency was declining in value so quickly that it would take a wheelbarrow full of German money to buy one loaf of bread, and it just got worse from there. Starvation. Thousands of German people died as a result of starvation because blockades were put in place to prevent them from receiving supplies from the outside world. Now, mind you, they've already robbed them of all of their resources as well. Street battle and the communists began to run rampant in Germany too. They were rising up because they already had Russia, and now they're trying to expand into Germany as well. So street battles between communists and German nationals would break out almost on a daily basis. The morality there collapsed. Berlin became a capital of decadence, pornography, and despair, trying to destroy the family. The very first transgender surgeries and scientists were in the Weimar Republic in that interim period between World War I and World War II. And this is when the German people stopped believing in politics and started longing for a savior. But they've already given up on Jesus Christ and God being a savior. And so we all know who they turned to. In 1924, Adolf Hitler, an Australian corporal from the Great World War, became the voice of national resentment. Say what you want about him. He could give a good speech. He promised to restore German pride, rebuild the economy, and defend Christianity against the communists. His main enemy wasn't anyone else. It wasn't the world, it was the communists and the powers that be in his own country that he saw destroying it from within. His message resonated with the people not because the Germans loved war, but because they hated being humiliated on a daily basis. So by 1933, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany through legal and democratic means. At this stage, Germany wasn't invading anyone. He was focused on rebuilding the country from within, rebuilding order, unity, and strength. So he started to oust these transgender scientists and doctors. The books that the big piles of books that you see that they show that the Nazis are burning, they were pornographic smut and transgender textbooks they were burning in the streets. Those were the books that the Nazis were burning during that period of time. Other stuff too, but they don't tell you that part. And before we go on, Hitler was a bad human being. He was terrible. But the argument that I'm making is that he was the inevitable outcome in a lot of ways of what was happening in Germany. And so, yes, Hitler bad, but Hitler was responding to what the people were demanding. In 1933, Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations, which was, again, that loosely formed body that was the precursor to the UN, and he reformed the Rhineland. And these were technically violations of the Treaty of Versailles, but not necessarily acts of aggressions. The Rhineland that he took back was originally part of Germany. French forces could have stopped him from taking that back, but they didn't, thus emboldening a dictator. In 1938, Germany reunited with Austria. Austria had originally been part of Germany. Hitler was actually from Austria. A lot of people assume he's German. He was actually from Austria. In September of 1938, a conference allowed Germany to take back the Sudetenland, which was again originally part of the original country of Germany. And they took it back from Czechoslovakia. And these were, like I said, these are actually German people being reincorporated back into Germany. At the time, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, came back and declared, "We shall have peace in our time." Hitler wasn't lying. These were what he saw as ethnic reunifications, not building an empire. Hitler didn't want to conquer the world. He wanted to restore German nationalism. Again, Hitler bad. I'm not a Hitler apologist, but I understand a little bit about where he came from. And this is all dates back to that World War I and even further back to that formation of the German country back in 1871. In 1939 is when things really started to get hot and heavy. Hitler demanded the return of Danzig, which was a German city that was now part of Poland. It had been incorporated into Poland in the Treaty of Versailles. And it was a very valuable port city that would be used to generate commerce and income for the German people. But Britain, under Winston Churchill, he's not the prime minister yet, but he is pulling the strings behind the scenes. He issues a guarantee to Poland that if Germany invades, Britain will go to war. And if Germany attacked Poland, Britain, and therefore Britain's allies, would also go to war. The truth was that at the time, that England's standing army wasn't really actually prepared to engage in any kind of a land war in Europe. So it wasn't even going to really play as big a role as they wanted it to be, and they would be relying on other countries to come to their aid in a land war with Germany. So this guarantee was almost a moot point, but still, Churchill made it. So Poland now rejects Germany. And Hitler, being convinced now that England won't actually do it, invades Poland on September 1st. And as a direct result, Britain and France declare war on Germany. And that's really what catapulted the world into its Second World War, or the second phase of the Great Civil War of the West. And we kind of know. And then there was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which is what brought the United States into that conflict. And my grandfather into that conflict. So, a lot of people view Hitler as the great villain of World War II, and basically of the entire 20th century. And again, Hitler bad. Hitler, terrible human being. But let's take a look at least one other character that might have been just as responsible for World War II and where we ended up as a result. And this might rub a few people the wrong way. It did me at first, but as I studied it more and I researched it out, I realized it's a really good point. Winston Churchill was a warmonger, and that dated back to his own experiences fighting as a soldier back in the Boer War. And are we being invaded already? Looks like the kids are here. What time is it? What's that?
5 minutes to 6.
Okay. All right. So we're not going to get this all finished today. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go over a few of these last points, and some of the overall fallout that we now suffer under as a result of the ideas from World War II. The West didn't just lose lives in those wars, it lost its conviction. And what had become as the defense of civilization actually became a retreat from it. The Great War shattered Christendom's unity, and World War II buried its confidence. The victors won the battle, but they lost the soul, the faith, hierarchy, and moral certainty that we now all view as dangerous. The world vowed, never again will we believe in anything strong enough to fight for. In this vacuum, bureaucrats replaced priests, global institutions replaced nations, and comfort replaced convictions. There's an idea out there known as the post-war consensus. And the core idea of this is that in order to make the world safe for openness, the strong gods, and this is that book that I talked about, Return of the Strong Gods, is about this idea. The strong gods that he's referring to are faith, belonging, and truth, as well as nationalism and strong leadership. Those were the strong gods that had to die as a result to make sure that nothing like World War II ever happened again. And Western elites built a fragile peace on this rejection of conviction. Religion was privatized, family politicized, and fatherhood and manhood pathologized. Public life was supposed to become neutral, but neutral ground is always enemy occupied. Economic stability replaced moral order. Material prosperity replaced any kind of true meaning. The result, a generation that was allergic to commitments and allergic to the idea of home and anything that represented that. As a result, also the things that we talk about that make America feel like home. A new religion of progress promised salvation through science and the state, and holiness was replaced by keeping things hygienic and antiseptic. Rather than jumping into a bunch more of this stuff, I'm going to leave you with that, because there's way more here than I'm going to get through, and these kids probably aren't going to want to sit through. Because while I find it interesting, they probably won't. So I'm just going to leave you with that idea. A little bit to think about and chew on, maybe redefining a little bit the 1900s for you. To think about where we've gone as a culture and where we've gone as a society, and maybe place a few of these key historical events in a little bit of context so that you can understand and know that they weren't just random events. They were part of a plan. Again, I don't know, I'm not going to speculate on whose plan that is outside of we have an enemy and we have an adversary, and he is smart and cunning and he knows what he's doing, but he generally overplays his hands. But we'll get into some of that next week. I told you I had a lot to cover this week, more than I even thought. All right, Phil, you're up.